Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And in this video I want to talk about the myth of Total War difficulty, campaign difficulty, that does exist in certain quarters of the community, from which you get posts like these. Now, I'm not calling out the person who made this post. I'm going against this sentiment that, oh, campaigns used to be harder before, because it might give Creative Assembly the wrong impression on what they need to fix. There are issues in terms of campaign scaling, there are issues in terms of the endgame, but people arguing that, oh, it used to be better before, as someone who's played Total War for 20 years, I can tell you that is flat out untrue. But let's read this post, or a portion of it. After spending some time watching how the game used to run on release, one thing is clear to me. People in the absence of Immortal Empires tried to play a narrative campaign in a way it was clearly not supposed to be played. Well, here's my argument on that. People played the narrative campaign when Warhammer 3 came out, and then they discovered that it was really bad. And so people decided to play a domination campaign instead and ignore the narrative aspect of the campaign. That's pretty much what happened, because spending 140 turns or so to win the narrative campaign was not really an interest, especially given the way how you played that narrative campaign. It was an absolute nightmare that took the world by surprise when rifts suddenly appear out of nowhere and start spawning demons left and right. Well, funnily enough about those demon rifts, they were actually a bigger issue for the AI to deal with than for you as a player, because you could deal with them very quickly. You knew where you could spawn. Once you play the campaign once, you figure out which provinces and which regions they would spawn, and then you just be ready to close them. Like, it might take a couple of times playing the campaign to figure out that, and to figure out the start, but once you did, you would end up dominating. And sure, the AI needed tweaks on anti-player bias for sure, but early on they would spawn many more armies and actively seek more objectives and expansion. Somewhat. The AI could be said to be more aggressive, but that's because when Warhammer 3 came out, you had demonic factions permanently at war with Order factions, so that did create a certain level of aggression, but it was not necessarily in a great way. But somewhere along the way, people would like to paint the map and do campaign narratives at their own pace, whined so much that CA nerfed AI to oblivion. Thanks to that, minor settlement sieges were reduced, AI created less armies, and so on. It's super disappointing to start a campaign where if I, as the Empire, do my best to keep the Empire alive and ready for the storm to come, and to my sadness, the enemy or threat will never come, because the AI suck and can't gather enough force. Well, truth be told, the AI was never really good at that, even in Warhammer 2. The only reason they seemed better in Warhammer 2 is because they cheated in terms of Confederation, and you would get those massive empires because of those cheats to Confederation. But in terms of the AI actually being a genuine threat, even in Warhammer 2, the AI, the hardest challenge was always early on. I'm talking here as someone who's played for 20 years, or almost 20 years of Total War, someone who plays on Legendary. But let's take a look at the situation in Warhammer 3, because I have videos on the subject. Old videos that I've had for years. So this one, in particular, this video, the Palace of Slaanesh Keys of Campaign, as Katrin, is the first video I still have of Warhammer 3. I started doing a Let's Play, those didn't do so well, so I decided to just delete them and just post those quest battles, or those narrative battles. So, the Realms of Chaos, Slaanesh, Khorne, and all that. The order, the optimization I had in this campaign was not great. But I did win it. It's very important. 2 days after launch, and keeping in mind how long it might take you to upload certain things, and the fact that I was trying to upload a playthrough and then realized it didn't work, but 2 days after that, I was pretty much winning the campaign. Because over here, this is turn 41, Katrin, this campaign has been over for over 10 turns. Here's what would happen when Realms of Chaos came out. You would start a campaign, you would start a war with 3 factions, something along those lines. Like with Katrin, it was Prague, it was Fraught, it was the Norskans, and if you'd encounter demon factions, you'd be at war with them. Not that they were much of a risk towards your capital, unless, like, oh, the Demon Prince showed up with an endgame crisis. Seriously, some of the rogue armies in Warhammer 3 were a bigger challenge than the actual legendary lords. We also have to talk about how the races in Warhammer 3 were not especially great, so it was fairly jarring coming from Warhammer 2 into Warhammer 3. Because there's a reason why Kislev has gotten reworked. There's a reason why Tzeentch has gotten an improvement. Nurgle, Khorne have gotten reworks. Ogres got a rework. That's because they weren't very well designed. And that was very off-putting towards a lot of people. And the race for the souls was not great. But look at his campaign. I've dealt with Prague. I think I've dealt with Mulder. Pretty sure I've dealt with Mulder, or Castellan has dealt with them. Either way, Frot is no longer a friend. Norskans are dealt with one way or another. And I have one entire stack under Katrin of her starring units and a bunch of Kossars. That's another great thing, because Kislev's economy was not that great. He would just recruit a bunch of regular Kossars until much later on. But I also have a second army, maybe even, no, 4 armies. However many you want to talk about, because like you can see those icons on the map. And this is turn 41, one of the very first campaigns I played. And this is not an exception. This is the rule. What would happen is you would start a campaign, you'd be thrown into the furnace, quite literally, and then you would probably lose the first couple of campaigns, or you'd quit them because you realized, okay, this is not going to go the way I want to, and then you would start new campaigns, and then you just dominating. Like this Miao Yin campaign, one of the very first campaigns I played, Wood Cafe, I had won it by turn 30. So the more you played of Warhammer 3 Realms of Chaos, the faster you'd win it, and then it was just like sitting around and waiting for dozens of turns for the rifts to spawn so you could go and farm souls. It was not difficult. It was not well paced. It was not well designed. But I'm not just going to harp on Realms of Chaos. Everyone knows that Realms of Chaos was pretty crap. Anyone who played that at launch, like, yes, CA made changes. They disabled the automatic declarations of war. They toned down some of the bullshit early on. But that's because that bullshit early on was not challenging. So let's go into the details of how you would play this and what you would manage, using the Katrin campaign as an example. So here's how a campaign like this would be tackled. Again, you would start a war with Frot, or very quickly a war with Frot. You would have Prague, you would have the Norskans. You would have those issues to deal with very early on in your campaign. You would have to fight and win every single battle manually. You can auto-resolve your way, even once you get the Patriarch. And you got the Patriarch pretty quickly in Katrin's campaign, but the casualty, it was so important to minimize your casualties, because you would not just have one battle, but several battles. This in itself is actually a problem, because when you're playing a battle that you know you're winning, but you're just playing it to effectively take 0 casualties, which, by the way, was very much the case with the Kislev army. There's a reason I have a bunch of Kossars here and not armored Kossars. Well, economic reasons as well. You would play these battles in a really cheap way. You could win these battles. It didn't matter if it was a siege. It didn't matter if it was field battle. It didn't matter if it was a minor settlement. And to the point, by the way, that a removal of minor settlements made campaign easier, or the sentiment on that, no. Minor settlements were some of the easiest battles in the game, along with sieges. And they still are, to this day. The hardest battles in the game, to this day, are field battles. And even though and that's because in a siege or in a minor settlement, the AI is very passive, kind of like how they are in the survival battle. But the AI is very passive, they're trying to defend the victory points, and there's a lot of different ways to win a battle like this with minimal casualties. In fact, the worst thing you could ever do in a siege or minor settlement is just go full-throated, let me fight barricade by barricade. Not only is that bad gameplay because of pathfinding issues, but it's also the way to take the most casualties. So you either, if you're playing a melee faction like Scarbrand, you just blobbed up your melee units and rush for the victory point, while maybe going for a distraction elsewhere, if you cared about such things. Or if you're playing a range faction like Kislev or Cafe, you would just get a bunch of range units, kill everything in sight, without even taking any kind of real damage to your units. And that did happen a lot. Like, what you're seeing here gameplay-wise is how you'd fight most minor settlement battles and how you would fight most sieges. Walls didn't matter. And mind you, even in Warhammer 2, when walls may have mattered more, you still had that dynamic. It's like, okay, I can win a siege without taking any kind of real casualties. That also did happen. But then you would get things like rebellions, then you'd get the rifts. And that just meant you had to devote resources for them. But you knew they were coming. You knew how they would be coming. So it's like, okay, I'm just going to recruit an army to close a rift with a couple of units because the first rifts are very easy. And I'm going to try and get my economy and get my empire as big as possible while preparing to semi-legendary lord on an adventure where they're wasting 10 turns of the freaking campaign essentially doing nothing to get the soul so I can complete the campaign. What ended up happening when Immortal Empires came out, that dynamic didn't change initially. And people realized, yeah, this is very grindy and boring. Because it is very grindy and boring. And so you get CA removing minor settlement battles because they suck. You may get improvements in casualty replenishment because guess what? Regardless of how people feel about having to fight manual battles over and over and over again, is not a great dynamic. But when you force a player to fight manual battles, not because they need to in order to win, not because it's fun gameplay, it's not most of the time, but rather simply because they want to take those 0 casualties, and when you force people to do that, it gets very tedious very quickly. Like, people got tired of Realms of Chaos extremely quickly. The player drop-off at launch was significant within the first few weeks. There's a reason CA rushed Immortal Empires, because they did. They probably wanted Immortal Empires to come out slower than it did. They rushed it as quickly as possible because people were no longer playing the game. The numbers, if you look at something like SteamDB, Steam charts, etc., you can see how bad those numbers were before Immortal Empires. And it's not just because of the big map. It's also because the gameplay of Realms of Chaos was not great. The challenge certainly wasn't there. But what ended up happening in Immortal Empires, well, that grind still remained. Like all those minor settlement battles, all those siege battles, constantly playing battles in a fairly boring way, but to maximize your campaign potential, ended up feeling very boring. So CA did a bunch of things. Like they have improved things like casualty replenishment, but the way you should view casualty replenishment is it actually allows you to play battles in a more interesting way because you know you can recover from that, as opposed to just abusing the AI non-stop for the highest level of power that you can have. And it also allows you to skip a bunch of battles that are not really that interesting, which is good. But they did tone down AI aggression, or rather they, in a sense, they toned down anti-player bias. The reason they did so is because having a bunch of minor factions attacking you is not really a challenge in many cases, or can be an early game challenge at most, but it's more about squatting flies. It's annoying, to be sure, but challenging, not really so much. So they were trying to improve the early game and the dynamics of the early game and campaigns with the changes they made. What I think happened, and what I believe happened as a result of this, is that what was revealed is that the end game of the Old War is not especially great, or non-existent. Endgame crises are not a great system, and the situation of campaigns is they were always the most challenging early on. In any Total War game that I've played, and I've played since Rome 1, it's always the early game that dictates the rest of the campaign. You survive the early game in a good enough position, you win the rest of the campaign pretty damn easily. Doesn't matter which game you're talking about, doesn't matter which campaign you're talking about. We can talk about the Uesugi and Shogun 2, same principle applies there. Things like Realm Divide, Endgame Crisis are just a crutch for the fact that scalability in Total War is not especially great. Funnily enough, I think Free Kingdoms actually had the best endgame scalability of all the Total War games I've ever played, because you would have massive empires forming up, and while still the early game was the most level of challenge, it was kind of interesting dealing with Sun Jian as Cao Cao when Free Kingdoms came out, and it's like, or Liu Bei, and they control like half the freaking map. Like, yes, Free Kingdoms did a lot of great things from that point of view. Or Troy, actually, with the massive war between the Achaeans and the Greeks. There are ways Total War can approach it in a better way than just like, oh, let's give the AI massive bullshit cheats, and let's have a dozen factions attack the player. That's busy work. That's not a challenge. A challenge is when you're having to deal with a massive empire that's built itself to be a massive empire in a legitimate way, and then having to figure out a way to still win the campaign when they might be ahead of you in several ways. Which, by the way, is how it felt in Free Kingdoms. Like, yeah, surprisingly, when I think about it, Free Kingdoms is the only Total War game that's actually done an endgame well in a way that didn't feel cheap. Maybe Creative Assembly needs to take more lessons from that game. Or even Troy. Literally, yeah, Troy. Because the complication in Troy is like, yeah, you could secure your early game situation very quickly, but then you had to figure out a way, okay, there's 4 different factions in close proximity to each other next to my senior Troy that I need to deal with at once when I cross the sea. How do I do so? That was an interesting dynamic. And so I think that would be a better way for Creative Assembly to deal with it. But one way it wouldn't be great for them to deal with is to look back at previous Total War games that didn't do the endgame well, which is the vast majority of them, and thinking, oh, the games used to be more challenging, let's make them more bullshit. That is not going to work. They need to find a better solution. Or hell, I would say even Free Kingdoms, like, it should not be considered an end state. It should be looked at something that CA can improve on. Because that did happen in Free Kingdoms. Sure, you could just go to war with Sun Jian, but then some other mega faction would rise up, probably. In that game. So I think maybe faction potential, maybe the AI building better empires in the long term. But that's an endgame issue. They certainly didn't make the game easier. They made it less frustrating and less grindy, especially in the early game. That's all I had to say. Christine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.